We are a leading consultancy and development company in the Netherlands, and we are totally focused on alternative real assets. So from healthcare, senior housing to educational facilities, like student housing, campus developments. And next to my position of HEVO, I'm also a visiting lecturer at the Amsterdam School of Real Estate since 2012.
Great, Marcus.
My name is Marcus Drummond. I head sales at VIC Properties. We are right now...
Is that working, that microphone? Could you hear that?
Yeah. Okay.
We're going to... Can we just test that microphone?
I think it's cutting in and out, but now it seems to be working. Am I correct?
Yep,
okay.
Great.
So, Marcus Drummond, head sales at VIC Properties. We are right now, we have the largest pipeline of residential developments in Portugal. We focus on building new neighborhoods and new communities. And because our first two projects, which are now in sale, construction and conceptualization stage, have about 500,000 square meters of development, we worry about how to make these organic in terms of neighborhood, diversified utilization, and also how people are going to move in and out and through these neighborhoods so that they are appealing destinations within and integrated in the wider context of the city.
Great. And Claire, you didn't say who you were and what your day job was, so now's your chance.
I'm Clare Thomas. I'm a partner with CMS. We are a law firm with the largest real estate team in Europe, so very excited to be here. I particularly work on the real estate report that we've done, and it's been fascinating to visit the various European cities and just find out what sort of the differences are between each of those cities when it comes to the residential sector.
Great. Rainer.
My name is Rainer Nonnengässer from International Campus. We have been amongst the first movers in the student housing sector in Germany some 8 years ago. We have quickly expanded from Germany our journey into the Netherlands and Austria, are today also covering CEE. We currently have some 4,500 beds in operations in these countries and another 5,000 under delivery.
Harry.
And I'm Harry Swales, one of the directors at Homes England. We are the UK government's housing delivery agency for England. And so we are there to support private sector partners and housing associations to deliver new homes. As a government aspiration in the UK, we're looking to deliver 300,000 homes sustainably every year. And at the moment, we're falling significantly short of that, delivering something like 230,000 homes. So we're looking to increase the UK's capacity to build new homes, and also to be building homes of every tenure to ensure that housing is more affordable and that we're creating strong communities across the country. And so we do that through our land ownership, where we're master developer creating new towns and urban extensions across the country, but also through our investment activity, where we provide government grant to deliver affordable homes and infrastructure to unlock housing capacity, but also financing and investing alongside private sector partners in joint venture to create the platforms to deliver more homes, more of the homes that people need in the right places in the country. So working very closely with cities and places across the country to build the right kind of housing that people need. And so really interesting to hear the discussion and debate today, both about what's happening more widely in Europe, but also as we think about what specialist housing and what housing we need through people's life cycles. So pleased to be here.
Good, thank you. Let's just maybe pick up with you, Rainer, in terms of the residential side that you're looking at. You've seen significant growth in that. What's driving that from your perspective? Is it some of the things that we saw in Claire's presentation? What's your take on that?
Well, it's a combination of a lot of elements. Firstly, we see in all the cities where we're active, and that applies to Berlin as well as to Amsterdam or Krakow or Vienna, a fast-growing number of young people being in education or even after education, whom we call unsettled professionals, who are looking for accommodation which is providing community, which is affordable, which is fresh, design oriented, and which allows them to move in easily for a limited period of time. And this segment, as said, has grown over the last years dramatically, and we still see that it's growing fast. For example, we've just opened a scheme in Vienna a few weeks ago, which was filled up in 3 weeks. And we have waiting lists on all our schemes in all the territories. And this is one aspect which is, let's say, the change in habit, the change in culture amongst young people. Second aspect is for sure the affordability aspect. In all the places we're active, we have seen rental double-digit growth year on year over the last 3 to 5 years, which makes it, in most of the cases, impossible to own compared to renting stock. And then the next element is, depending on which market you're in, your rental stock is bigger. For example, in Germany, where renting has a big tradition, or it's smaller, like for example in the Netherlands or in CEE countries. And these factors together describe the high attractiveness of these products for a developer investor side, as we are, but also from a tenant's perspective, who feel that this is the appropriate product for accommodation depending on the life cycle situation they're currently in.
Good. And Ron, maybe picking up with you, explain a little bit about, particularly in the Netherlands, what you call senior living and how that relates to healthcare as well, because I think that sometimes the definitions change. So maybe pick up with that first, and also how do you see what you're doing in relation to the sort of student housing, micro-living, co-living kind of side?
So we first start with a short lectureship about definition. Oh, well, I think it's interesting because healthcare is becoming a mainstream asset class from the care and the cure side. So we see senior housing, assisted living, to nursing homes from long-term care. And we see the more cure side, like private clinics, hospitals. But I totally agree also with Claire, because it was a great presentation, that the grave aspect of the business is the most interesting part. Yeah. It sounds a bit strange, but I think it is, because when you look at the 65 people who are 65, they take over like 25% of the total inhabitants of a country. Yeah. So when you look at the last year, we see explosion of deal flow. When you look at healthcare, for example, in the Netherlands, we had about 1 billion of deal flow. So I think it's very interesting. Also, when you look at the student housing element, I think it will be more and more a mixed-use development, because also seniors, they would like to live actually within a normal housing product. So we don't have to make a different development only for the seniors. So I think it will be very much interesting to get more and more mixed-use developments from student housing, PRS, towards senior living.
Okay, good. And I'm going to come to you in a minute, Harry. But Marcus, you're also developing in Portugal, in Lisbon, quite a large scale. And you mentioned there are other developments to come. Quite a large scale element. What are you having to do in terms of that curation side, the mixed use element? How do you see that, and how important is that sort of trend that Ron mentioned there?
Okay, so it's important in the way that because we do neighborhoods or new districts, and we tend to see them on a holistic perspective. But once you start to think through the offering that you're going to have, and because you have a lot of product, let's say, in your shelves, this allows you to do something that's going to target different market segments. So for example, if you can start with studios or one bedrooms, which are going to be great, for example, for student accommodation, young professionals, depending on, throughout the life stages that they are, and all the way to senior living, as long as people make the choice to be integrated in the neighborhood with everyone else and feeling like they are still participating in the daily life of where they live. So that's definitely a way. And also the way how we curate the retail, how we curate the options of transportation, leisure, food, so we make life appealing for all these different segments, customer segments, and we can do that because we have the size, the scale to accommodate all these different options, and that's going to bring a wealth of diversity to the neighborhood.
Okay, good. And Harry, obviously in the UK, Homes England has quite a target in terms of the amount of housing that's got to be delivered. The majority of that urban, I would imagine. What are the challenges that you see for that? And are you also having to, or are you looking at how this mixed use, creating a community, those aspects of it are driving what you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. They're incredibly important. So while we want to be able to deliver that target of 300,000 homes, it's not just a numbers game. It has to be about the right kind of housing and creating the communities where people live. So, you know, Claire pointed out the challenge in London at sort of house prices being 13 times salaries. That's actually 8 times nationally. So it's not just a London issue. It is an issue across the country. And it's not one that's about to abate. So we see there being 4 million new households created over the next 20 years, taking us up from sort of 23 to 27 million households. So that challenge is going to continue, and with an aging population, we really need to be able to respond with a more nuanced offer in terms of housing and different housing at different points in people's life cycle. And we're starting to see some of those propositions come through. I think that part of that affordability challenge means that we're seeing more rental housing, and typically in the UK that has been a buy-to-let market, quite a granular ownership without the institutional backing. You know, if you look at that market, it's about £1.2 trillion, and at the moment less than 5% of that is in institutional ownership. So there's a real opportunity to increase institutional investment and therefore that long-term patient capital. So I guess from a demographic perspective, the demographics are in investors' favour, and it's about finding the right way to bring that to bear on the kind of homes that we're building. One thing I would say though is it's not just about a rental proposition, it is also about home ownership. Over 85% of people want to be a homeowner, but I think we need to think about that through people's life cycle. So shared ownership is one way that we're making it more affordable to access home ownership earlier in life. But as we look at you know, homes for later in life, we're starting to think about how you might look at shared ownership in the reverse and actually start to release equity to pay for care and to support older age. So I think how we own our homes through our life is something that could really change over the course of the next couple of decades, and we're doing a lot of that thinking now. But we want to be doing that with partners, with investors, with people who are actually, you know, on the ground creating those communities as well.
Okay, good. Claire, I thought it might be interesting just to get your perspective as somebody who was at the events that we ran both in London but also in Paris and in Amsterdam and in Berlin. Were there any trends that kind of came across in all of those as similar, or were there different topics in each one?
I think it was interesting. We started out in London, and I think, as Harry just alluded to, it was very clear that the sector is less mature in London, so investors really concerned about how you manage these sort of schemes because it is more operational. So maybe a little bit of an apprehension in the UK about what's being taken on, whereas when you move to Paris and particularly in Berlin, you know, very well established markets, so people very confident in the product. But I think the one thing that has started to come out is that the ESG type thing, it's worrying about the social impact of what we're doing, whether that's on the community that you live in or whether it's the actual sort of bricks and mortar that you're dealing with. That really seems to be apparent, and I think fits in maybe with, you know, the generational differences that we're seeing and in terms of people's priorities.
And I'm wondering, Marcus, because obviously Portugal, we know traditionally, as opposed to somewhere like Germany or the Netherlands or the Nordics, has traditionally been, particularly for house development, has particularly been development to sell. Do you get a sense that, I mean, when I've been talking to people in the Netherlands especially, the session we had there was a large part of it which was around that idea that whereas before they had been building mainly to sell, that actually now this had changed, and actually institutional investors were providing the same returns as previously a private buyer was. Do you think there's a chance of that? Are you beginning to see more institutional investment in terms of the projects that you're seeing, or is it still really mainly sold one by one?
So what we are seeing is something quite interesting. It ties in with the context of what happened in Portugal after the crisis, which is during the crisis there was no access to credit, so people stopped buying, and there was also a change in the law, which incentivized homeowners to put their houses on the market for rental, to kind of cater for this demand. So what we have seen is that after a few decades in which home ownership, especially through bank lending, was the main option on the market, now because of the barriers of access and the incentives for landlords to become landlords, that the market which had been frozen for a few decades heated up massively, and this has caught the eye of institutional investors, which have started moving in and becoming the type of professional, well-structured, very organized landlord that eliminates one of the main hurdles for individual peoples to decide to rent, which is my landlord going to be very picky or not responsive or leave me to my own devices and never care? So that is one of the things that they are able to offer, is something that is really appealing, because people feel more confident in renting from an institutional, professional landlord that's not going to make a tiny thing into a huge problem.
And Rainer, from your point of view, is that something that's also the case when you're looking particularly at those sorts of student markets, that kind of area, where people are looking for a reliable landlord, a brand? What's the position there?
For sure, it's to a certain extent we are somewhere between classical residential and hospitality. So brand building, brand promoting has an impact. It's also extremely helpful whilst marketing schemes across locations, across territories. And finally, the word of mouth is something which helps a lot in student blogs and in social media. So if you do good, it spreads pretty quickly. If you do badly, unfortunately, it spreads as quick as well. And I think in the long term, those developer-operator conglomerates who can cover the vast majority of the value chain, plus being active across certain territories, will succeed over the one-hit wonders, which we especially in Germany see on the development side. Guys who have done resi development locally for 20 years and now hop on the trend of micro-living or student housing or whatever name tag you put on it, but lack, let's say, the DNA of development which is necessary for this type of product, and also have no idea on what are the operational triggering points to make a scheme a successful scheme.
And that's interesting, actually. We work with the collective who are the co-living in London, and they actually say their biggest fear is a new entrant coming into that space who actually doesn't understand what's involved and can't manage that operationally, and giving the whole sector a bad name. So it is very emotive because, of course, it's people's homes, so a slightly different bricks and mortar to think about.
And healthcare also, in that same way, senior living, there's obviously been, in the UK for sure, there were high-profile kind of issues with that previously. What's your sense of it? Is it becoming a more institutional asset class? What are the drivers for that, and what sort of product are people looking for?
Oh, well, I think the most important driver is the aging demographic, so that's for sure. But I think it's interesting to see that we develop the senior housing side and the more specialized nursing home side. So indeed, the last element, is really an operational thing, because it's about high care, it's difficult to do the operation, etc. But the other side, it's about senior living.
Yeah.
And to my humble opinion, it's just a residential development. So it's about services, it's about being flexible, it's about individual rents. And I think this is very important because when you look at long-term nursing home, you can have a master lease with an operator. So from an investor perspective, your guarantee is on the master lease. But I think senior living will be more and more a private, one-on-one individual rent sector. And I think that's very important. So we also see various types of investors who are focused on the management side, individual rents, or the master lease side.
And I think we are staying much healthier later in life.
Yeah.
So there's a section of the community who actually, they may be retired, but they want to live in a vibrant community and have access to all of the same sort of services and amenities as younger people.
But I think
They
it's
don't
also
want to feel
important.
like they give up.
Yeah.
But I think affordability is the key thing, especially for the resident. But affordability is even more important for the investor, because when we make business cases, and when you look at the cash flow will give you a guarantee. So when your business case is on the right level, when it's on the right rental side, you've got a great business case. So therefore, we also should especially be focused on not the high-end side, but people who can pay like 800, like 1,100 euros per month rental. That's the maximum for the most residents. So I think that's a very important task also for institutional investors to make this type of product.
Okay, good. And Harry, in terms of the UK, are you then? How do you see that where you've got senior living, you've got different kind of things? Are you having to try and blend that, and how does that fit with the affordability side? Because presumably, what's affordable in London is for sure not affordable in Newcastle.
Yeah, so I think affordability is incredibly important, and our build-to-rent sector, as we call it, probably did start at the higher end with enhanced service provision. But we need to make sure that in all kind of sectors and communities that we have an offer that people are able to afford and see as good value. So in certain markets, that enhanced service is very important to people and can be a real differentiator. In other markets, it's about getting the basics right and providing good quality, safe housing that people can afford. I think back to the kind of consumer point, with the kind of social media and the kind of tech-driven way society is interacting and communicating with each other, consumer reputation and word of mouth is so important. We in the UK have just got a new website that calls itself the TripAdvisor of housing, HomeView, and that's causing a bit of a stir because it's giving residents the opportunity, both homeowners and renters, the chance to say very publicly how they experience the homes that they live in and the way that their landlord or the developer treats them. And so I think that level of transparency really raises the quality of housing and is the kind of challenge and transparency that we should all be ready to respond to. But when we look at larger strategic places and communities, it's really getting that mix. So we are creating a new town on the outskirts of Cambridgeshire. Homes England are the other master planners there. So it's really getting the combination of houses, the right kind of tenure that provides the affordability and the price point for everybody in the community, but also people through their lives. So to ensure that there is enhanced specialist housing for people later in life, but also that there's housing for first-time buyers and families. We're seeing quite an expansion of the single family rental market. So ways in which developers are creating family housing, not the apartment blocks that we originally saw in the kind of emerging build-to-rent space. So it's getting far more nuanced, and I think there are some platforms out there that are really looking to meet very specialist groups of society and give them the housing that they need, rather than necessarily just the kind of initial product that we saw coming into the market maybe 5 or 6 years ago.
Okay, good. And Rainer, I just wanted to sort of, you mentioned that you were operating across different parts of Europe, including the CEE. Just highlight, if you can, some of those markets. How are you seeing them performing in comparison to one another? Are there particular hotspots where you're looking to do more?
Yeah. So looking back at, let's say, 10 years history in that sector, I do remember when I started looking into student accommodation in Germany, investors were looking at this as an exotic alien, and there was nearly no product standardized, industrialized, existing. As we all know, that has changed rapidly in those 10 years. And to a certain extent, that also applies to other European countries. For example, the Netherlands was 2-3 years behind Germany. Spain is a little bit behind. Now we are focusing on CEE, where the situation is like in Germany 5-6 years ago. What you face is in different countries, different legislations, different taxations, different rent control regimes, different building specs. So it's adding complexity whilst adding other countries. But I think it gives us a competitive edge compared to our competitors because we are in a setup that embraces these specifics, and I think we are doing quite well coping with these. So even if you are in Europe or within the EU, you have to face different requirements in each and every country, and that is the biggest challenge.
Are there cases in your portfolio where you had to come up with a new solution? You had to come up with a new solution in a new market that you entered, and then you saw that it actually worked really well, and you retrofitted that solution to the previous.
So, for example, we talked about that earlier. We've tried to do something, or were intending to do something in Portugal a few years ago. And in Portugal, there was a hotel regime which was limited to 30 nights, and there was a resi regime which was starting at, I think it was 4 months or 6 months. So there was a gray zone in between. So accommodating a student for 4 or 5 months were not legally possible in that system. Similar in CEE, where the fallback is mostly hospitality. So, for example, the schemes we are building in Poland, we're building in Czech Republic, we're building in Hungary are, as regards regulation, all hotels, and because otherwise licensing would not be possible. And as these countries do not have limitations at, let's say, maximum length of stays compared to other countries, for example, in Germany, if you have a hotel license, you are legally limited to 6 months. In some communities to 30 nights, so there are tricky elements around it, and partly it's commercial leases, partly it's residential leases, and this describes the complexity when it comes to operations.
Which is, and you can either decide to tell me what you think the biggest trend is that you will see, i.e. what will we be definitely talking about next year in this discussion at Expo Real, or you can tell me where you think the best opportunity is in life cycle investment. So those are your two tasks. You can choose one or the other, or you can be daring and do both if you wish. Let's start with you, Harry. Just in terms of the trends, what do you think people will be talking about in this, to do with this space next year?
Yeah, well, I guess if we get the trends right, we should be trending on where the opportunities are. So I'd probably answer both questions by saying that, you know, the demographics across Europe are just compellingly leading towards us needing to think far harder about later living and the care and support that needs to go with it. So I think that will become an increasing part of the debate in real estate and residential real estate across Europe.
Okay, good. Rainer?
I'm quite sure that over the next few years, maybe already next year, this name tagging exercise that we're currently stuck in with student accommodation or PRS or co-living, micro-living, blah, 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 will somewhen come to an end, and we will have something like blended living or whatever the name then will be, or at least covering the first third of the life cycle, because whether people are in education or whether they have their first job or whether they are commuting over the week, the requirement is pretty homogeneous. The technical and architectural and also the amenities side of creating such product is also quite homogeneous. And I think this will put a lot of pressure on regulator and municipalities to allow for those different types of consumers to merge into one specific scheme.
Okay, good. So next year we'll be actually calling it blended living. I like that.
We'll
That's
see.
good. Claire.
I think we've actually got a prop tech panel coming up next, haven't we? So I think it really has to be technology. And I think that's both from the point of view of technology is driving demand because young people have so much flexibility in terms of the way that they live their lives. They don't need one base in a way that they have done traditionally. And then also technology having an impact on the way that we manage these investments, whether it's the use of Google Homes to deal with maintenance requests or AI. So I think it's technology.
Okay, great. Marcus.
Okay, I'll be a little ambitious, and I'll try to blend both in one. So something that I would, as we know, the trends that are out there, and we all know which they are. They're widely reported. So it's about what you do with the trend. Something that I would, and this is where I'm going to jump to the ambitious part, is something that I see we think is going to happen beyond the trend. So we are talking life cycle investment, right? We are more people are going to be old, but these people who is the generation which has the most amount of home equity in history, even they will die. So there will be a massive equity transfer to what we call now the millennial generation, which will be inheriting all of this equity. And the millennials have been so far very detached from ownership because they have nothing to own, hard access to something to own. However, it will fall on their laps in the next 20 years or so. And I'm very keen on the implications of this kind of neo-hippie generations like the one we had in the late 60s and 70s, which then became the most materialistic generation up to the mid-80s. So I'm curious to see whether, as this wealth transfers to current millennials, what the implications will be for developers, for operators, and for real estate product that they will finally have access to. That's something that fascinates me a lot, and that I would pay a lot of attention. I think we'll be talking about it in a few years.
Okay.
Maybe not next year, but in a few years.
So we may have to wait 20 years for that one, but that's okay, you know. That's good. Ron.
Well, I had some thinking time for this $1 million question. Well, I think next year on this event we should talk about the valuation of ESG in healthcare investments. Because I think this is the most important thing, when we can make a valuation of the impact side of healthcare investment, and that we can also reduce the yield side, look on a critical way to risk and yield. I think this will be the best opportunity.